Well, thank you guys so much for showing up. This is the second time I've been at MacAdmins. It's always a good time. So we're going to talk about Ruby for MacAdmins. I'll give you a brief overview of me. My name is Nic Scott. I work for Kenyon College. It's a very small private school, about an hour northeast of Columbus. Professionally, Ruby scripting, automation, DevOps, forensics, those sorts of things. Super exciting. Personally, HBO is really good. Dry humor, IPAs. I realize at 9 a.m., IPAs makes it sound like I have a problem. I didn't choose the slot. That would have worked right after lunch. And there's some ways to find me online, so if your day is already going in the wrong direction, there's some ways for you to waste some more time. So we'll kind of get right to it. So why Ruby? Ruby is sort of not as popular in the MacAdmin community as, say, Python. So this is not a talk about why Ruby is better than Python. So much of the ecosystem in the Mac world is Python-based. The entire Monkey ecosystem, auto package, all of the sort of smaller tools that we use as MacAdmins, right? Docutil, auto damage, these things. Python has done some amazing things for us. So this is not about why Ruby is better than that. Ruby is different than that. I use Ruby because I enjoy it. It's fun. It really helped me getting over the learning curve of learning a programming language. I do Python. I've got some Perl. I've got some Swift. I can do some of these things. But on my day-to-day basis, when I'm just dealing with data, I'm just dealing with some reporting back, I like to use Ruby. It was a nice entry point for me to get me into these concepts, or what are arrays, how do you deal with data, those sorts of things. How do you filter? So we're going to look at 4 areas here. We'll go over a basic setup. We're going to cover some basic Ruby concepts. The code is going to be very, very simple. It's about the concept, not the code. We'll talk about working with plist, and then we'll kind of look at some examples of things admins can do with Ruby, some of the things I'm doing, and hopefully it'll give you some ideas of something you can do. Setup. We'll go over, is it installed? What version do you have? How do you run a script? Right. If you have a Mac, you have Ruby installed. You can pull up a terminal and run ruby-v. You'll get something back like this. Almost everybody will have 2.0 or higher, but if you have 1.8, you are fine, and I would assume if you're running something older than Mountain Lion, you've got 1.8. If you have a Windows machine, it's not installed, you will have to install that. Probably not right now. If you want to know where Ruby's at, you can say, which Ruby? It'll give you the path. Unless you have installed your own Ruby, this is what it should look like. If you have a higher version, I've got a couple versions on mine, so they're installed somewhere else. But this should be your path back. That should be your shebang, right, in the top of your script. You can open terminal and type IRB. They'll give you an interactive Ruby prompt. You'll get back a main line like this, which just means it's ready to go. And as a really simple example, we can say puts, quotes, hello, and that'll spit back hello, right? Very, very simple, right? We're just giving Ruby something to basically spit back out to us. And you're going to get this line on the bottom that says nil. You can kind of disregard that. Ruby always wants to return whatever's left over, whatever the object is, but there's nothing to return here. It already gave us back our value. So you can just get used to seeing the nil. It means you're fine. So in a script, I would open it up. I would run that same thing as IRB. I would just run it like this. I would just put in my shebang, puts hello. Very, very simple. I would save that to the desktop, and then you have a couple ways to run this. You want to make sure you save it with a .rb extension. You can open terminal and you can type Ruby and then path to, or you can make it executable. So if I'm working on my machine, I'm typically going to make it executable because I'm going to run this multiple times. It's just easier. Maybe that's not best practice out in the wild, but that's how I develop. So after I make it executable, I would just do this. I would just drag it to my terminal, return. It's going to execute whatever the script is. In this case, it's just hello, very lackluster. Strings and integers. Strings are a very simple concept, right? Anything inside of quotation marks, Ruby sees as strings. Integers, we're just going to think of them as numbers. It's a little more in-depth than that. You can get into floating. You can get into big numbers. For the sake of this, we're just talking about numbers. So again, the string example here, right? If we say puts anything inside quotation marks, Ruby's going to spit back. It's going to see it as a string. So hello, MacAdmins is a basic Ruby object. That's what's great about Ruby. It sees everything as an object, and objects are immutable. You can change them, you can manipulate them, you can modify them, you can do things with them, and Ruby provides you all sorts of cool ways to interact with them. So you have lots of options here. So if we wanted to make a string, say, all lowercase, we can just add on the .down case. Converts the whole string down. And if we wanted to go all uppercase, it would be .upcase. So right away, you can see you have these options where you can start to do things with your strings. We can concatenate, right? So if we can take multiple strings, we can just tie them together with a plus, and it'll spit back, hello, MacAdmins again. Same thing. The bottom example there puts 3, it'll put back 3. So we've got that 3 in quotation marks, so Ruby is going to see that as a string. And to prove that Ruby sees that as a string, you can call .class. Class is sort of what kind of object am I dealing with here? I do this all the time when I'm dealing with code and I'm trying to run something and it's giving me an error back, and I'm like, but I'm running this, this method on this object, and Ruby says, well, yeah, but you've got the wrong object. So in this case, you've got 3.class, and Ruby says, yeah, this is a string. This is not a number. And that's helpful, because now that I know I have a string, I can ask Ruby, what can I do with strings? So I can call instant methods. Methods are sort of, think of them as your options. What can I do with an object? Ruby's going to provide you some built-in methods. So this is going to spit back a whole list of things. All these things you can do with strings. So we did upcase and downcase. But this is a great learning tool, right? So you can go through here and go, I don't know what these do. What does? Well, there's reverse. That's cool. I'm going to throw that on the end, see what it does. It's just going to reverse the text, right? So this is a good idea to know. Now that I know how to use a string, what do I do with it? So for an integer, we would just say puts 3. Ruby puts back 3. We can do some basic math. There's nothing overly exciting here. It's just basic. But this time we're going to call class on 3, and it says it's a fixed num, which in Ruby, before 2.4, they're kind of broken apart into fixed nums and big nums for bigger integers. After that, they're unified. So Ruby just says, look, this is a number. So we can do the same thing. We can say instant methods. We'll get back that whole list of options. What can we do with numbers? Or what's probably a better tool is rubydoc.org, the documentation, right? If you go there and you click on Core API, then you click on your version on the left-hand side of the web page. So for mine, I had 2.3.1. You scroll down. They have classes. You can search or you can just find it. So you would click on fixed num. You would get a page like this. And you'll see on the left-hand side, you got methods. That's what it's spitting back, instant methods. All of your options there. Examples, documentation. I show that because I think that is so important when you're learning something new, because it's not about, I want to do something really big with Ruby. Well, yeah, but the first learning hurdle is, I don't know what I can do with what I have. And it's really hard if you don't have somebody next to you pairing with you to say, well, what about this? Oh, you could do this. So this was a huge learning hurdle for me. But once you understand what the documentation is and where to get it, you realize now I have these options. This is how I can manipulate the data. So you can do that for any class in Ruby. Variables. They're just used to store information. Most of us are probably familiar with the basic concept of a variable. Ruby has a couple different kinds. You have local, constants, globals, class, and instant variables. We'll just sort of show you, but we're not going to get into depth about all of these. Local variables, best practice should start with a lowercase or an underscore. So name Joe or underscore name Bob. Constants are meant for things that don't change, static, and they're all uppercase. So path names or information that you just don't plan on changing later in the code. Global will start with a $sign, and it just means it's accessible through the whole code. So if you define it at the top, everything on the code can access it all the way down. If you're just writing one-off scripts, you probably don't even necessarily get into globals, but if you see it, that's know you're dealing with a variable. Instant variables have a @ at the front. We won't cover those. That's just outside the scope, but again, it's a variable. And the same with class variables. We won't get into classes or class variables, but if you see them, it's just another. You can go look it up on RubyDoc. It's just another variable. So we'll cover flow control here. And we'll look at some very basic examples here of an if statement, right? So we've got a variable that equals 3, and we've got some code that says if x equals 3, then puts out this result. And then on the right-hand side, it says, yeah, x is 3. Very simple. Syntax of the Ruby if statement there. If keyword, always end. Not all languages do that. So if you're coming from like Python, you don't have that end closing bracket there, that keyword. You can do if else. Similar, right? You're just adding an else afterwards and pushing that end bracket down. Another one and saying, well, if it doesn't equal this, then do this. You have a case statement, which think about it as like a multiple choice. So instead of writing if, else, and giving a bunch of else's, you can do a case and say, well, my variable is 5, but when it equals 5, do this. When it equals 6, do this. When it's 7, do this. When it's 8, do this. If it's none of those, then you have the catch-all at the bottom that says, else, I don't know what you're doing, right? It'll just spit back. You have until loops. So x is 5 here, and we're just saying until x equals 0, we're just going to loop through in -1, and then it's going to run. So this is going to run a set amount of times based on whatever the condition is, right, that you give it. And the same with a while loop. Again, while x is less than 0. So I don't really use a lot of until or while loops. But if it makes sense for you to do that, that's totally fine. It's just going to run a set amount of time, right? And unlike an if statement where it just says, hey, as long as there's things to do, I'm going to keep chugging through this. I tend to use that sort of methodology, but if this makes sense, Ruby has that. You have a for loop. So in this case, for x in a range of numbers, so 1 through 10, it's just going to go through, cycle through, print it out. And I have to show you the each statement because I think Ruby is kind of getting away from the for statement, right? And I think best practice is don't use for, use each. It's sort of a social hot button issue like tabs or spaces or like your favorite text editor. So we won't get into why you should use each. But there are some technical differences sort of on the back end in terms of what's returned. For almost always works, but each is sort of a streamlined way of doing it. So in this case, it's just got a list of numbers, 1 through 5, and it's saying, take that list of numbers, and for each of them do X, and we're just printing them out. Arrays. They're just ordered integer indexes of objects. It's a list, right? So this is pretty basic. We have an array called fruit. It has 3 items, apple, orange, banana. And to print that out, we simply say puts fruit, and Ruby spits back what's in there. But they're ordered. So there's an index number here, right? So if we wanted to say, well, what's in the first position? We can say puts fruit, brackets, 0. And Ruby will say, well, apple, again, because 0 is the starting point in a programming language. But this is good too, because arrays are objects, and objects are mutable, so we can change them. We have some options. We can deal with them. Same way we can with strings or anything else. So we can do things too, like I know you contain banana, I just don't know what order you're in. You can ask and say .index whatever you're looking for, and Ruby will spit back and say, well, banana is in position 2. I can help you find things in the list. If you wanted to add an object to the array, you just push it, it'll push it back onto the end of the stack. So you can say fruit.push kiwi, it'll add it, and then you see we print it out, and now it's added it on to the bottom there on the right-hand side. If you wanted to delete it, you would just give it that value, right? It'll take care of the index number, and you just say delete kiwi, puts it back out, and it's gone. If you wanted that list in alphabetical order, you can say sort. You would get it back. So in the array on the left-hand side, it's out of order. Ruby just changes it. It doesn't change the original array, it just changes the results. If you want to know how many items you had in your array, you can call .length. Ruby will say 3. Or if you had multiple results, so in this case we got two apples, right? But we say, I only want to see what's unique in this array. You can call unique, and it'll say apple, orange, banana. So that's kind of cool, because that makes me think, what if you had a fleet of machines and you're pulling back OS versions? You're obviously going to get duplicates, right? But you don't want to see duplicates. You just want to see uniques. So you don't care that you have 100 machines on 1012. You just want to know 1012's out in the fleet. So you could call unique on your array, and it would put back only what unique is floating around. Hashes. It's a collection of key value pairs, dictionaries in some other languages. Think of it almost as like XML, right, where you've got keys and you've got values. So it looks something like this. So we have a hash named person with some key values, key, name, value, John, key, age, 40, favorite food, pizza. John is American, I think. So this looks easy to digest because it's just a very simple example. And it looks a lot like Puppet, if you've ever used Puppet, a manifest. So this would be to create a user in Puppet. Puppet is Ruby on the back. That's sort of what got me into Ruby. After dealing with it and going, wait, this looks like something else. Puppet's just using hashes, basically. So if we wanted to print out a hash, the same way we sort of printed out the array, you could just say here, puts OSs. But you're going to get back something that's not really human readable, right? You're going to get back everything after the equal sign. You're going to get back the curly brackets, the whole thing. And that's fine for something small, because you could parse that yourself. But if you're dealing with something much bigger, you're not going to want to go through there, because you're going to get all of the quotes and sort of the hash rockets down the middle there. So you have to loop through it. So we're going to do an each statement on line 8 and just say we're going to loop through basically this hash and say do key value. We're going to take those values and then we're going to print them out and we're going to concatenate them with a semicolon. So that when it prints out, it's just more human readable for us. But there's nothing special on line 8 with the words key and value. Okay? Ruby knows you're dealing with a hash and it has a key and a value. You can name that whatever you want. And this is something for me that took forever really to understand. You can see code and you can use somebody's code. And so many examples use X or I. And you start thinking, I got to use X and I because there's something special. And there's not. Ruby doesn't care. Right? To prove the point, you could switch it out and say, well, give me puppy dogs and ice cream cones. Ruby doesn't care. It'll give you back puppy dogs and ice cream cones, and you get the same result. So it's more of understand what you're asking for and not necessarily, Ruby takes care of the logic. It doesn't care. It just knows that whatever's in those piped brackets, that's what you're asking for back. If you're dealing with an array, it's going to give you one variable. If you're dealing with a hash, it knows it has a key and a value. So whatever you put there, it'll spit back. So hashes are objects. We can work with them. So we can start asking some questions of our hash here. And we can say, does our hash contain mountain lion? And it's going to say false. It'll cycle through there and look for us. But if I said, does it have 10.9, it'll say true. Okay, so now I can do something with that. I can say, well, if the key is 10.9, tell me what the value is. And I know that 10.9 now exists, so I can put that through there and say OS's bracket, whatever key you're looking for, and Ruby will spit you back the value. If you wanted to add a key value pair, it's pretty simple. On line 8, you just add your new key and assign it a value. Ruby will take care of where it puts it in the index. You can see this is the example of putting out the OSs on line 10. You get that mess that's not necessarily human readable. And that's why I said, that's fine because it's small. But if you had a hash that had hundreds of lines, you wouldn't want to parse that yourself. If you want to delete it, you just give it the key name, and Ruby will take care of the value as well. It'll clean up after itself. Some other methods that you can call. You can ask it if it's empty. Am I dealing with a hash that actually has data? And Ruby will say, no, false, we've got data already. You can say, how long is it? We've got 4 items. If you just want to see the keys, you can ask Ruby.keys. If you just want to see values.values, and it'll spit those out pretty cleanly. You can call .class, and Ruby will tell you, yes, you're dealing with a hash. And again, you can say, well, what are my other options here? What are my other methods I can call? And you can call .instant methods, and you'll get back that whole list that you'll see on Ruby docs. Methods. Methods are, they're just bundled code. Think of them as like a function in Python or Bash. They should begin with lowercase letters, and you have to define them before you call them. Typically you would define it higher up in the code and then call it later on. So a basic syntax looks like this, right? You use the keyword def, your method name, all of your code you want to execute on the inside, and then the end statement. So if we go to our first example, if we just want to put hello MacAdmins out, right, it just puts hello MacAdmin. But if we wanted to make that a method, we would put it within our keywords of the def and the end. And then we would just call that PSU Mac, and it will spit back hello MacAdmin. So you get the same result either way. You wouldn't necessarily make a method to do something that simple, but it's to show you just the structure. You can do math inside of them, right? So this one is just adding 3 plus 3. And when you call add, it says it's 6. just to show you it can work with integers. You can give it arguments. So on this one, the method is double, and we're taking one argument called x, which again, the x has no meaning. You can call it whatever you want. It's just going to take that and times it by 2. So on line 6, whatever I put inside those parentheses, it just spits back into the code, right? So in this one, 5 times 2, 10. But you could add more code in there. You could say, what if I wanted to show everything inside the applications folder? So we're just going to loop through it, put everything, or print everything out that doesn't start with a period, right? Because I don't want anything hidden. And then you just call list of apps on line 10, and it would spit back whatever it finds. So you can add more code in there for sure. In fact, I would say that's what makes methods so valuable, right? You want to put your code in there so that later on you can just call it very simply and reuse that code without rewriting it. Working with plist. So as a MacAdmin, you almost certainly will work with plist because that's how Apple chooses just to store their data and their values. So we have a way to do that with Ruby. It's called CF property list. And it reads both binary and XML property list defined by Apple. This is the Ruby gem link there. But you probably already have it installed. You can open terminal and type gem list. You'll get back a list of Ruby gems installed on the machine. If you've never installed them, you'll probably just see a couple. It's what's included. You should have CF property list. It might be an older version, 228, something like that. Totally fine. If you don't have it, you can install it. It's very simple. Sudo gem install CF property list. It'll take 30 seconds because it's just code, right? Or if you wanted to update it, sudo gem update CF property. So we'll show you an example here. So we're going to install it, and then we're going to require it at the top of the code. And then lines 5, 6, and 7 are, we're just telling it basically what plist we want to work with. It's going to convert that plist and save it all on line 7 into a variable called data. So it's just going to basically read everything in that plist and shove it into data so that we can start working with it, right? So then on line 10, you can say, put login window text because I want to read the apple.login window plist. And I want to see if there's a value in that login window text, and it spits back for support, contact, helpline. So this is the same as the command on the bottom, defaults read. So you would say, well, then why would I write 5 lines of code if I can just do it with the defaults command? And I would say you probably wouldn't, right? If you were at somebody's machine and you just needed to run a one-off, I doubt you're going to write 5 lines of Ruby code, require CF property list, and go through the whole song and dance. You're going to just do defaults read, give me back the value. And that's fine, right? Use the tool that makes sense for the job. You want CF property list for more complicated things. It can handle more complicated plist or more complicated code. So it's reusable, right? So you would define that at the top of your list. You would reuse it later on in your code. But I wanted to show you, you get the same results. So if you're familiar with defaults, we're doing the same thing here. But you could shell out in Ruby too. So if you just wanted to run it in Ruby, you could. You could just put it inside backticks, and Ruby will execute your native bash code. A warning there is Ruby will execute your bash code without asking. Wherever you put that in your script, it's going to execute and give you back that result, and that may not be what you want. You may want to call it at a certain time. You may not want it to return the value. So you can do the second option here of assigning your bash command to a variable, and then using the system command and calling it. And then it treats it more like a variable, where I don't want to see those results, and I don't want you to execute it until I call it. Sometimes this is the only way to run code. Sometimes you can't get around running bash code. There are certain things that the easiest way to get that information is through bash. But you can do that, and Ruby can handle that. It's not a problem. So this is a little more complicated now, because now we're not just reading from a property list. I want to write data back to it. So the first 7 lines there are the same. We're requiring CF property list. We're feeding it our plist into the variable data. But on line 10, we're just changing values out, which looks a lot like it did on the hash example, right, where we're just assigning a value. So essentially, we have a hash named data. The key is login window text, and the value is going to be call help desk for support. To save that back, lines 13, 14, that's just CF property doing its thing. Like, don't get hung up in all the CF property lists and be like, I don't know what it's doing, .native types, and that is the structure it needs to run. You type that once and it works, and then you paste it, right? Don't worry, but don't get into the weeds about all of that stuff. It's saving it back, and it's writing that value. It's the same as using defaults write. More lines of code because you're doing it all through Ruby. But this gets us to a point where we can start saying, well, what can we do with it? So if we can work with strings and arrays and hashes, and we can make a method to reuse some of our code, what can we start doing? So these are some basic examples of things that I do. The code here is going to be a little bit longer, so it's not meant, we're not going to go line through line. But it's just some simple concepts here. If you wanted to see like a list of users on a machine, it's basically looping through the users folder again and giving me those results into an array, spitting out anything that ends or starts with a period, because I don't want to see hidden folders. And then I'm just telling it to give me the results. So here it's just saying total users, you have 5 users. That can be helpful, right, for a shared machine or something that's public. I want to see how many people are logging into a machine, see what kind of use it's getting. But if I wanted to step on that and say, well, I've got 5 users, how many of those have local admin rights? I could sort of reuse this code. I could do something else and say, now that I have those users, let's also loop through that list and check their group membership against local admins. And basically, it's on the line 30 there, it just says, give me a list of local admins, and it spits back, well, you've got these people are in the local admins group. This is little list apps after deployment. We'll explain that. So when giving a new user a machine, right, it's nice and pristine, it's got everything you wanted on it, and maybe a year later it looks nothing like what you gave to them. You can say, well, I wonder what the user has installed since they've had this machine. So this is a way of basically building a list that'll put back those results and say what's been installed after you got the machine. So up on the top is an array called base apps. It just has all Apple's stuff out of the box, right? You could put in whatever you install out of the box in that list as well, if you install Office, whatever. And then it's just looping through applications and comparing them, right? And saying, if you're in base apps, we don't want you. If you're not in base apps, we're going to basically print you back out. It gives you a very simple list of, say, well, this user has installed 52 items. This is what they're using. Sometimes that can help you either diagnose problems, or if you're going to switch their machine and you can see, oh my gosh, they've got all these things installed, we better cover these. Are these our apps? Are they their apps? Before we wipe this machine. This will give you back a list of apps in the user's dock. This can be helpful too, right? If I'm replacing somebody's machine, I want to see what are they using, what's in their dock. If it's in their dock, chances are they put it there and they're using it, so it's important. Or if I'm building a machine, say for a shared purpose, whether maybe it's a chemistry department image, and they have a machine now, and I want to say, well, I got to build an image, what's in their dock, because I can kind of mimic that. It'll do that for me. It'll only report back persistent apps. So things you've dragged there. It will not report back if you open terminal and it pops up in the dock. It's not going to report that back. But this is handy because it'll print back your results that match the actual dock for the user. So I take this all the time, and I throw it into a script that calls docutil. So you start getting some black magic, right? Because now you're using Ruby and you're calling Python and you're doing these things, and it works, and it's amazing. And you can set docs this way and run it as a post-install script on a machine to say, install all these apps, last script, set the doc. And you just feed it basically an array at the top of everything you want in the doc, and it takes care of the rest. Or if you use ARD, you've probably seen this on the left-hand side, where you start saving your commands, and they start building up. And after a couple years, you can't find your command anymore. And you're just like, I've got 50 commands saved. I can't find it. It would be great if it looked like the right-hand side, and you had folders, and you can organize them. Apple does not give you that native ability. They get that native ability with the first 4 up there, because those are their commands, but you don't have that ability. But this is just a plist file. If you track it down, path is on the bottom there, and open it up on the left-hand side, it looks pretty innocent. It's got a couple items. You can see under the type column, it's an array, and then dictionaries. We can deal with dictionaries. They're just hashes. But you start opening this up, and you realize it's a nested mess of arrays nested with dictionaries, nested with arrays, nested with dictionaries. You cannot edit that with defaults. You could probably do it with plist buddy if you wanted to. I don't like plist buddy. I just don't like the syntax. It doesn't work for me. So I wrote some code that helps me do this. And it basically creates folders and moves commands in folders, and the results look like the right-hand side. So I can start saying, well, I've got reports I want to run. I've got admin commands I want to run. And that code, to make it simple, makes some methods. So I can easily just call on the bottom here, ARD create empty folder, call it whatever I want. Take the name of an existing command and move it into the move command, existing command, into this new folder. It'll take it in there. So it gives me a way to start organizing this stuff. Which gets you to Ruby gems. So Ruby gems are just code, right? It's code from somebody else that you can use. You can download it and install it just like CF property lists, and it's reusable. You require it in the top of your code. You have access to the code to all those methods. I have a few. Marshmallow is a collection of OS facts for MacAdmins. If you've ever used like Puppet's Factor, very similar. It'll spit you back if you want to know something basic like a serial number. UUIDs, there's some interesting things in there. It'll report back on profiles, what the name of profiles are. The computer info fields and the sharing pane that you see in Apple remotes. Also similar to Joseph Chilcote has a Python script called PyFacts, kind of reports back facts for you. Cookie Dough deals with apps in reporting. What's in the applications folder, what versions are they, what's in a user's doc. Panes helps you disable system preference panes or enable them. And the ARD gem was from the last example, helps you sort of organize ARD commands. I realized when naming code, it's actually much harder because everybody has names for their code. And then I realized I like food, and nobody names their gems food, so you got marshmallow and cookie dough. I guess that's, I don't know what that says. But here's a simple example, though. You require marshmallow, and you say it puts marshmallow system launch agents. You get back system launch agents. You can do launch daemons. You can do user launch agents, user launch daemons. So if you wanted to monitor those things and pull a report, it's pretty simple syntax to do that. Cookie Dough, doc apps, put in a user. It'll spit back that user's doc apps. Same rules apply to Ruby that apply to Bash. If you're doing something outside of your permissions, it's going to require a sudo. So just keep that in mind. However you decide to run that code, it's going to need sudo rights. If you are the logged in user, it'll pull back your doc. If you don't give it an argument with the user, it'll take the current logged in user. Here's another one, all app versions. This just loops through applications, spits out the app and the version. This can be handy with like Adobe because they install all of their stuff into folders in the applications folder. So you have to go directory deep. And then you always know, do I have the same versions across machines, especially for those applications that are not backwards compatible. You've got InDesign, you've got Premiere. Somebody's got one version, somebody doesn't, and now they can't open files. This is a really easy way for me to do my Adobe updates and to report back and make sure, yes, everything's on the right versions. Disabling system preference panes. In this example, if you wanted to disable the sharing pane, it's pretty simple. It's panes.disable and the bundle identifier. If you wanted to do the network settings, maybe you got static IP information you don't want somebody to change, you could do that. You could lock down profiles. I wouldn't do this necessarily for an end user, but if you're doing a public machine, a shared machine, it can be a really easy way to just protect those settings out of sight. Pretty straightforward there. But that makes me think, what else can MacAdmins do? What about the Finder? The Finder is a plist. You could edit that. You could put things into the favorites servers for users. That's pretty straightforward. You could set the desktop if you wanted to make it look a certain way. Icons, text on the right, size of the icons. Printers. Printers would be really cool because there's about 4 or 5 bash commands to manage printers locally. You've got LPadmin and LPOP and cups and all these things. It'd be great to combine that into a Ruby gem. So you've got one kind of syntax to install, delete, clear a print queue, set defaults. Deploy Studio reporting, I use that a lot because Deploy Studio is all plist on the back end if you look at the workflows. So there's not a lot of reporting in Deploy Studio. So if you want to say, well, I've got 100 packages in my repo, right? But how many of those are being used? There's not a great way to figure out or to clean up or to audit what you're doing. But you can pull all that stuff out of the plist and say, I've got 100 packages, loop through all my workflows, check packages. I'm using 90, spit out the difference. I'm probably not using these 10 packages. Or it's a good way to archive workflows. You could export out all of your packages. You could get a list, what am I using, and then just copy those to another folder. Copy the plist out, delete it off Deploy Studio when you don't need it. Collecting, filtering data, Ruby's really good at that. You've got regular expressions. You can do some pretty cool things. You can loop through those arrays and hashes, right? Ruby is great at parsing that data. So it just gets me thinking of all the other things MacAdmins can do in that kind of space where you consolidate that code down and reuse it. And it makes sort of the day-to-day administration a little bit easier. There's a few resources I want to cover. There's a good video from JNUC last year called Alleviating the Apprehension of Coding in Ruby. I believe that's by Chris LaSalle. It's worth watching if you are into Ruby and you want to see more practical examples. Ruby docs, documentation, Ruby in the MacAdmins Slack channel. If you post a question there, you'll get a response. There are some people who do a really great job of responding and helping people out in there. If you want to learn Ruby, Codecademy is really great. Self-paced online. You can do that course over and over. Really kind of hammers down the fundamentals of Ruby. Launch School has really good documentation. It's just very clean, the way they present it. And sometimes that documentation is better than Ruby docs, so I just throw that in there. And of course, Ruby gems, when you get up and going, you can search Ruby gems for all sorts of other cool things that Macs can do. There's some of my spots, my blog, my gems, my GitHub. You can pillage those and use them at your own expense. Most of that is sanitized, so shouldn't take down your company. And I'll leave you with this, Ruby. Learn some Ruby and do something cool. So if you don't know Ruby, start out small. Take one command. Whatever you're doing in Bash, do it in Ruby. Even if you have to shell it out, save it in Ruby and run it. And then add something else. And then ask yourself, could I do this in a native Ruby way? And you just start building. You don't have to look and say, I want to do this thing. It's 500 lines of code, because it feels overwhelming, right? You just start small, and then you start asking, and you're going to run into obstacles and say, well, I'm getting back this data, but it's got extra spaces on the end. How do I get rid of these spaces? And then you're going to go and you're going to find that out. You're going to answer that question, and then you're going to move on to the next one. Well, how do I loop through this? I'm not getting back the results I want. And you just start building and building and building. And it's one line at a time. And eventually, you've got some Ruby code that does something pretty cool. And then you can share it with everybody else. So that's it. I appreciate it. I guess we've got plenty of time, so if anybody has questions, we can do some questions with the catch box. Yep.
Is Ruby interpreted or compiled, and if so, is the other version available?
It's not compiled. So I guess one of the complaints with Ruby is maybe it's not as fast as other languages. And you lose, if you're going to work with, say, like C libraries, Ruby doesn't have a way to get you there. If you want to work with like Objective-C and you need a bridge to get there, you're probably going to want to look at Python, because Python has a native way to get there. Compiled Ruby, there's a cool language called Crystal that's compiled, and it has Ruby syntax. It's very fast. It's new, but you should look into that. It's very cool. It's got some C libraries. It's all compiled. It executes. It's very slick. It's basically C with some Ruby syntax on top of it. So, is that a good sign?
My question is kind of related to how Ruby shells out. So speaking from experience with Python, so if you use like the OS module in Python and the os.system,
Yep.
you'll run into limitations with commands that often like will have a lot of pipes. So in that situation, which you don't want to get into, but sometimes you have to with some discal information where you're parsing out or something like that, you'll use the subprocess module, which has methods that can do things like pull a return code for you, give you output, or do both.
Right.
What are the limitations of Ruby's ability to shell out, and are there places where it will fail?
You can do
what
the same,
do?
basically, right? You could split that off into a separate process and run
Okay.
it, so you're not basically bottlenecking that. If you're just doing a simple command that's just like the example, right, a defaults command, you would just shell it out with the backticks because it's going to execute and come back. If you were doing something that had a lot more processing going on there, because Bash isn't the fastest either, right? So if you're doing something complex and you're getting back a lot of data, if you were going to run like System Profiler and then try to ARP or grep something out of that in Bash, you could split that off into a separate process.
Okay.
Ruby has that ability as well.
Okay.
Thanks.
What kind of projects or tasks or maybe something else would motivate you to say Ruby is good for this kind of thing versus when would you run from Ruby or when would you pick something else?
Can
you think of anything that would characterize those?
Well, I think it depends partially on what ecosystem you're working in as well. I mean, if you want to contribute to, say, a lot of the open source projects in the Mac community, you're going to have to go to Python because that's where people are at. If you're just doing something locally on your machine, there's no limitation there. You can use whatever you want. And again, Ruby has those limitations of like C libraries, so if that's where you want to go, it's probably not the language for you. I'm using it mainly as a way to just do simple things that I don't want to write in Bash, right? Like I don't like for loops and if statements in Bash. I just don't like the syntax. I never have. I don't like parsing data back. I think it's easier in Ruby instead of ARPing and grepping and setting. to tell Ruby, run this bash command, and I'll actually do all the filtering in Ruby instead, because I think that's a lot easier, even substituting and finding words and switching them out. I find that a lot more human readable. So for me, that's why I would go to Ruby on like my day-to-day task. I don't think I've ever worked on something where I felt like Ruby wasn't the right solution, but I'm positive there's examples of it. But
Thanks. So I got a couple of questions. One of them kind of contingent on the first one. I assume kind of like Python, Ruby is object-oriented, correct?
Yes.
And if so, does it have, it doesn't have the access modifier properties like Python, like no private or public or protected or?
it has those.
Oh, it does?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you can find all those. So if you're creating, we didn't get into classes, but if you created your own class or your own modules, and you've got methods in there, some of them, you can make some of them private,
Okay.
either to that class specifically, so everything in the class can read it, but everything out can't, or you can make it completely private so that nothing else can access that.
All right.
So if you were making something that had a lot of like methods, like 10 methods, but if a user called a method and it doesn't actually do something because it's just being used internally in the code, you could make that private. So that if they actually printed out the instant methods and got back those lists, they wouldn't see that. They would only see the public methods.
All right.
So, yeah, it's got all that.
This one's an easy one. Does white space matter?
Does white space matter?
I mean, not in like a pretty way, but in.
I was gonna say, is this hypothetical? Where are we?
You can take that question and go as deep as you want.
Yeah. Ooh, yes and no. Not as finicky as like bash, because sometimes in bash, even when you're doing like a variable, and if they're not like pressed up against equal signs, you can get some funny, like if you do space, it'll give you some funny stuff. Ruby is not that finicky. But yes, so if you're running a command and sometimes it'll give you back extra space, like a carriage return or something like that. So Ruby does care about white space, and you have to deal with that basically. If you're taking input from a user, it's almost always going to give you the extra space, the carriage return, even if you don't see it, and then you're going to try to execute code and be like, I don't understand what's going on. It's because you have to basically chop that space off on the end. So it does.
My arm's not that good.
But so sorry, just to clarify on that. So I know, just to make sure I'm really clear. So it doesn't matter if, for example, like I put all of my code like on the first line and I didn't indent anything. It's not going to mess up how it gets interpreted or anything like that. Because I know some languages that aren't bracketed or something like that really care about where the indentation is.
I don't think Ruby
On the
cares
code.
about that, but honestly, I don't know, because I try to do. So if I'm using like Sublime, it's handling all of that indentation for me. I don't know the last time I've written. Yeah, I think it does, right? Because it has to be indented, right? Because if you're doing like a method and you've got the def and the end statement, everything has to be indented properly. And if it's not, if it's on the same lines, it'll error out.
Okay,
Yes,
cool.
so it does.
I don't know if that was
It does care.
that was the point of the other question or not. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, I'll take that.
Yeah, that seems great.
So, a follow-up question on his clarification of the first question. So, I've never used either Ruby or Python. Yesterday in one of the sessions, we were doing a little bit of Python, and they explicitly told us, excuse me, that you have to use, like if you're using spaces or tabs, it must be the same throughout the whole file.
Yeah.
Is that the same with Ruby?
Yes.
It is. Okay.
Yes.
But it doesn't matter which, as long
I
as
would
you're
suggest
consistent.
you use a text editor that handles that for you.
Okay,
If you're going to use like text edit to write your code, you probably don't want to do that. There are lots of great text editors that'll just handle that for you. They'll set a default, and if you hit tab, it's got tabs set, or it'll convert spaces to tabs, and you don't really have to think about it. Yeah, if you want 4 spaces or 2 spaces, like you can customize that. Like the Atom text editor is great. Sublime is great. Text Wrangler, TextMate, there's plenty of text editors out there that you don't really have to worry about that stuff.
okay,
So,
thank you.
Now we've really hashed out spacing.
I know. I didn't want to go there, but we're going to go there. I think that's it. So there are some Ruby stickers up here if you're so inclined. Feel free, grab one on the way out. New conference trend. Everybody has to give stickers. And that's it. Thanks so much, guys.